Hello world and welcome to this edition of Tech on Fire with Blaze. I'm Blaze Stewart, an architect at Winelect, and today we're going to be looking at the Windows Subsystem for Linux. Today I want to look at the Windows Subsystem for Linux, sometimes called WSL. The reason I want to look at this tool is because it is a very useful tool for developing software on Windows that is intended for the Linux platform. The Linux platform is the most popular platform in cloud computing, whether you're doing virtual machines that run Linux or you're running something like containers. Using the Windows Subsystem for Linux, though, enables you to have a more seamless development experience whenever you're writing for something like Linux, or you're writing something that might be cross-platform and you need to test it on Linux and Windows. Now, originally, it was written as a subsystem that would run apps on Windows more natively, and it provided that tight integration with Windows to make it more seamless. And in version 1, this looked something like this, where you had Windows 10, there was a compatibility layer, and then a Linux app ran on top of that compatibility layer, and then you had your Windows app that would then have a tight integration with that Linux app across this compatibility layer. Now, the compatibility layer essentially would intercept Linux system calls and translate those into Windows 10 system calls, and then return the results, and then reverse the process, and then return that back to the Linux app. Now, developing a compatibility layer that essentially emulates an entire kernel is a rather daunting task. Now, the compatibility layer in V1 of WSL was a good attempt at that, but it was limited in its functionality. It didn't do everything that the Linux kernel could do. So with V2 of WSL, they took a different approach, and they started off with Windows 10, obviously, and then they used Hyper-V. And rather than try to develop an entire replacement for the Linux kernel, they actually implement the Linux kernel on top of Hyper-V. But this is a virtual machine, but it's a very, very bare bones virtual machine. It's just running the bare bones for a virtual machine to get the Linux kernel up and running. There's really nothing else on top of that Linux kernel running on top of Hyper-V for Windows Subsystem for Linux in this case. And because this is a full Linux kernel, then it does give you the ability to run a full-blown Linux app that is fully capable of doing anything that you would do on Linux if it were running on a bare metal or in a virtual machine in the cloud, or on through some other kind of hypervisor such as VMware or VirtualBox. Now, because this is a full-blown VM and you have Hyper-V, you still have to provide some kind of way of crossing that boundary between the VM and the host operating system. And this is where the WSL compatibility and integration really shines, is because rather than try to build that compatibility layer, they focused on how do I get the integration between these working very well. And so with the app running on Windows 10 on the host, you have strong integration across the Hyper-V and across that Linux kernel into the app. And that is where WSL V2 has focused much of its effort on trying to make that integration really tight and seamless, and making the process for getting it up and running on Windows very seamless and easy to do. So with that in mind, I'm going to show you how easy it is to set up Windows Subsystem for Linux on Microsoft Windows version 10, and then show you how easy it is to install something like Ubuntu and then get something up and running on Ubuntu. It doesn't require any kind of finagling with a virtual machine or any kind of like deep knowledge of the Linux subsystems or how to install it. It's actually really easy to do, and it's one of the easiest ways to get started working with Linux on Windows without having to do all that stuff related to VMs. I'm here on my Windows desktop, and to install Windows Subsystem for Linux, I'd simply just go over here and to my Start menu and go to my Control Panel. Now, on the Control Panel, you can change your view to large icons, or you can use categories, however you have that set up. What you'll want to do is go into programs and features, and where that is this icon right here. And with programs and features, you can come over here to turn off features, turn Windows features on or off. And this is going to give you a list of features that you can install on your machine. Now, to make this work, you need to check a few boxes here. You need to make sure that you have Hyper-V enabled. So you would come over here and click on Hyper-V, click that box there, and then you want to scroll down and click on Virtual Machine Platform and turn that on. I already have that one turned on too. And then come down here, and there should be one that says Windows Subsystem for Linux, and you just simply click that and click OK, and then it's going to run the install, and then you'll have to reboot your computer. So now that I have this done, I'm going to go ahead and reboot my computer. Now that I'm done with my reboot, I need to do some more installation. The Windows Subsystem for Linux installs a basic kernel that I can use, or a basic set of tools that I can use, but it's not a full-blown set of tools that I need to do everything on the Linux context. So I still need to install some additional tooling, and this comes from the Windows Store. So I'm going to go to Microsoft Store, and I'm going to search up here for WSL, and then it says run Linux on Windows and get the apps. And what this is going to do is it's going to pull up several options for different distros that I can use with Windows Subsystem for Linux. I can use Ubuntu, OpenSUSE, Kali Linux, Debian, and Fedora, or other ones like this. Now, the one I'm going to choose is Ubuntu, simply because it's a very popular distro to use with the Windows Subsystem for Linux, but you also have several other ones that are available as well. So let's go ahead and select on Ubuntu and then download and install this. So when this downloads and installs, it's going to take a while, and I'll come back whenever it finishes. Now that the product has been installed, as it says right here, that doesn't mean that it's actually ready to use. What you need to do next is come over here and click Launch, and that's going to launch the terminal to actually install some of the components and configure the Windows Subsystem for Linux to use Ubuntu as the distro of choice for running applications. So we'll come back when this finishes. Okay, now that some of the components have actually installed, it's asking me to punch in my Unix username, so I'm going to use Blaze, and then I'm going to give it a password and re-enter the password, and now everything is ready to go. Now that I have the installer and run and I've closed that out, I'm going to come down here and launch the Windows Terminal. I'm using the Windows Terminal app that's in preview, and it's a replacement for the PowerShell ISE or the command prompt, and it's more of a generic terminal that you can configure for any number of other shell-like programs like PowerShell, command prompt, or bash, whatever it might be. Now, I'm in PowerShell right now, but I'm going to be using the WSL command because it's the terminal command that allows me to interact with the Windows Subsystem for Linux. So if I type in WSL and do --help, it's going to show me the commands that I can run inside of this particular WSL environment, and it's got a lot of different arguments that I can pass into it. I'm not going to go through all of these. I do want to run one called WSL-L, and it's just going to show me the list of WSL Linux distros that I have installed. In this case, I have installed Ubuntu. So I'm going to default that because it's the only one I have installed. So if I want to get a bash shell to interact with this particular Ubuntu install, I can just type in WSL, and then that will start bash. First thing you'll notice is I have a mount point here for my C drive. So this has that tight integration with Windows, and I have all the files that are on my Windows C drive mounted into my Windows Subsystem for Linux here. So I can do ls and it'll list my files that I have available inside of my home folder, which is exactly where I'm at here. So if I wanted to install some software on this, I would use apt.get just like I would on Ubuntu on a virtual machine. So if I do sudo apt-get install, say, nginx, and this will install nginx in the WSL and will allow me to run a Linux-based web server right on top of this Windows Subsystem for Linux. Now, because this isn't a full-blown VM, it's kind of a Linux kernel running in a VM, but tight integration with Windows, it actually shares the same IP space that my Windows host does, so it doesn't get its own IP address. So the other caveat that this would have is it's not using something like systemd to manage services on the Windows Subsystem for Linux. It is a full-blown kernel, but it doesn't have a lot of those other utilities and supporting software that makes it more of a full-blown operating system. Rather, it relies on me to run commands to make things happen. So if I wanted to start nginx, I literally have to start it manually by typing sudo nginx, and that actually starts the process. Now that that's running, I should be able to launch a browser here, Chrome, and just do http ://localhost, and that will pull up nginx right there. And the nginx that this is hitting is the one that's running on the Windows Subsystem for Linux. So no smoke and mirrors here. It's just using the local host to point to a process that is running on the Windows Subsystem for Linux in the same IP space that my Windows host has. So there are some learning caveats that you have to figure out whenever you're working with this. It's not a full-blown Linux VM, but it's got tight integration with Windows, so you kind of have to figure out which parts are tightly integrated and which parts are still more like that Linux experience. So that's one of the learning curves that is a part of using the Windows Subsystem for Linux. But all in all, it's a very nice tool for doing things on Windows that would otherwise be done on Linux. So what are some of the pros and cons for using the Windows Subsystem for Linux versus using something like a Linux VM or some other way of interacting with Linux? One, the Windows Subsystem for Linux is very easy to install. So we saw this in the demo where I was able to go into programs and features and simply do a checkbox, and that installed the Windows Subsystem for Linux, and then I just went into the Windows Store and installed the Ubuntu distro for that, and I didn't have to download an ISO, I didn't have to configure a VM, I didn't have to provision any of that or have any kind of that system knowledge that's needed to install Linux. That's very easy to do within the context of Windows to get the Windows Subsystem for Linux up and running. Two, there's a lot less overhead involved with the WSL than there is for a full Linux virtual machine, and we saw that this was very easy to install and it's very lightweight in terms of the total number of bytes it's downloaded, which translates into a rather small footprint whenever we actually use it. And the overhead for this then is a lot lighter than what you would otherwise have a full-blown virtual machine running on Hyper-V or VirtualBox or VMware. And third, we saw the tight integration that it has with Windows. We saw that it mounted my file system from my C drive into the Windows Subsystem for Linux file system, and we saw that it shared the IP space with the little nginx demo we did. So this tight integration makes it real easy to use without having to configure firewall rules and routing and try to figure all that mess out with a VM. And it integrates tightly with applications like Docker for desktop if you want to do container development, or programs like Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code whenever you're doing Linux development against a stack like .NET Core that will run cross-platform, or Node.js that will run cross-platform as well. But like anything, it's got its cons as well. Because it is not a full-blown virtual machine, you have fewer available distros for this. So a company like Canonical that's responsible for Ubuntu would have to build a distro specific for the Windows Subsystem for Linux, which they've done, and they've done a fantastic job with it. They're one of the main driving forces behind WSL, and they partner with Microsoft to build out that Ubuntu distro for WSL. But there are other distros available that we saw inside of the Microsoft Store there that we could have downloaded and installed as well. Second, you lose some of the fine-grained controls over the environment. So with the Windows Subsystem for Linux, it's more or less the environment being configured for you. With a full-blown virtual machine, you get much more fine-grained control over the environment, and you can configure it more like you would if you were actually going to be deploying your application that you're running in the WSL to the cloud and a Linux VM or in a container. The ability to have that more fine-grained control over the environment makes learning the Linux subsystems and the Linux commands and how it works easier, more complete, and more like you're going to experience in a production environment, while the Windows Subsystem for Linux kind of isolates you or insulates you from that to some degree. And thirdly, it uses Hyper-V. Now, not that Hyper-V is bad. This is not a diss on Hyper-V. It's basically a problem between the compatibility of Hyper-V and other hypervisors on Windows. They don't play well. So if you enable Hyper-V on your Windows box, you can't use VirtualBox and VMware while Hyper-V is installed, and vice versa. If you need to use VirtualBox or VMware, you have to disable Hyper-V, then reboot your VM. And if you did that, you wouldn't have the ability to run WSL or any of these other kinds of virtualization integrations that are done with WSL. So it's kind of an either-or proposition whether or not you want to use a VirtualBox virtual machine or Hyper-V, but with WSL, you couldn't use those in the same context together. Now, I've heard in the winds that there is supposed to be a fix for this coming. VirtualBox did a workaround in one of the later releases where it will actually use VirtualBox will use Hyper-V as the virtualization context for running virtual machines on some VMs, but it doesn't use its own virtualization stack. The trade-off there is that you have to have a virtual machine that can transfer between the two rather easily. Now, VMware, I don't think has that feature like that, but in the future, it's supposed to resolve this issue to where you can run Hyper-V alongside a VirtualBox or VMware at the same time. So there's probably other pros and cons we could talk about, but these are some of the major ones that I experienced in my use with WSL. And so it's a matter of choosing which platform, which approach for using Linux that you want to use. Do you want to use WSL, have that more integrated approach for using Linux in the Windows context, or do you want to use something like a virtual machine on VirtualBox with VMware and be able to have the full virtual machine with a full Linux experience inside of that particular virtual machine that you would put on VirtualBox or VMware. So it's trying to figure out which one to use and when to use it. That's a balancing act. And for people that are new, Windows Subsystem for Linux is an easy way to get your hands on Linux, but it's going to also shelter you from a lot of the things that Linux can do. So at some point you will probably have to touch a virtual machine at some point to be able to configure software to run in a production environment or the like. So that's going to wrap up our video for today on the Windows Subsystem for Linux. Stay tuned next time, where I think we'll return back to our series on building a application that is using services that are hosted on Azure Functions and using serverless technology for building a blog. But I wanted to do this tool today just because it was one I've been using a lot lately and wanted to cover it. So thanks for watching this edition of Tech on Fire with Blaze.
If you like this content, please consider visiting us online at www.wintelect.com, and there you can find about services that Wintelect offers, including training and consulting services. Also, please consider subscribing to this channel by clicking on the subscribe button and clicking the bell icon to get notifications when new content becomes available, and also comment down below. You can also follow me on Twitter at @TheOneMule, and also follow Wintelect on Twitter at WintelectNow or at Wintelect. We are constantly posting things about Azure-related technologies and things related to software development. You can also reach us by email at consulting@wintelect.com. Until next time, thank you.